You're listening to the pharmaphorum podcast. My name's Dominic Tyre, and I'm pharmaphorum's creative and editorial director. For episode 23, I spoke with Brendan Martin, who's acting head of Europe and general manager UK and Ireland for Alnylam, about its work in gene silencing. We also looked at just what it means to be a biotech in 2020 and his own approach to biotech leadership. With the impact of COVID-19 still inescapable in so many ways around the globe, we also discussed how it's affected Alnylam and how the company works. You can find more details of this episode, including a download link for the podcast and information about other instalments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The Pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast and Stitcher, where you can find and subscribe to it by searching for Pharmaphorum. So, Brendan, welcome to the Pharmaphorum podcast.
Thank you, Dominic.
And so, for those listeners who maybe aren't entirely familiar with Alnylam or your work indeed in gene silencing, can you tell us a little bit about the company?
Sure. So Alnylam was founded with a very specific mission in mind and a very specific purpose around RNA interference. So back in the late 90s, a series of observations were made about a naturally occurring process of controlling gene expression in the cell through selective destruction of messenger RNA. And this had obvious potential as a therapeutic strategy if it could be controlled. So Alnylam was set up in 2002 with the very specific purpose of harnessing this observation in biology to develop useful therapeutics in human medicine. And what we've been successful in doing is demonstrating a very reproducible, repeatable, predictable ability to downregulate or silence the expression of specific genes at will. And that signals the way to a very powerful therapeutic strategy in the future. And we have already managed to license 2 drugs for very different indications in genetic diseases. And we have a number of other exciting prospects in our pipeline to come to fruition, hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years.
And indeed, I believe your chief executive, John Maraganore, said that you may even have 4 drugs on the market by the end of 2020. Although, of course, you've already made your own bit of biotech history, I believe, in terms of getting the first ever FDA approval for a gene silencing drug. So certainly sounds like you're making great strides at the moment with the technology.
Yes, indeed. We got FDA and EMA approval in 2018 for our first RNA drug, and that's now on the market in the US and Europe and Japan, and it is meeting or exceeding our expectations as a therapy in a disease where previously there weren't that many options for patients. It's a devastating, progressive genetic disease. It really has brought hope onto the horizon for that community of patients. And then last year, we licensed our second in a different genetic disease, and we have an application currently under review in both Europe and the US for a 3rd drug, and others coming in the near term.
And we're recording this episode of the Pharmaphorum podcast in May 2020. And currently, of course, the effects of COVID-19 are pretty much inescapable in so many ways around the globe. Can you tell me a bit about the impact that the coronavirus has had on Alnylam and how you work?
Yes, indeed. So our first concern when this shutdown started and there was clear evidence in Italy, for example, that there was a real risk hospital systems could become overwhelmed. So our first concern was around patients and the continuity of care for patients, the ability to diagnose new patients and bring them on to treatment. All of that seemed under threat as health systems were enveloped in the coronavirus crisis. So we set about prioritizing what those risks were for patients and seeing if we could find mitigations. And we've learned quite a few things through that process. First of all, the importance of digital and virtual interactions with physicians, because clearly visits to hospitals weren't on anymore. And so we found the medical community very receptive to digital media and various ways of engaging online. We also found that they were very receptive to problem solving and solutions for their patients. And actually, they were being very mindful and carefully planning how they could assure continuity of care for the patients that they looked after, even in a crisis situation. And one of the things that struck me is that if there was ever any doubt that there could be a relationship of trust between the healthcare system and the pharmaceutical industry, with a common goal of taking care of patients, that doubt should have been dispelled through this exercise, because I think the level of collaboration and trust that was demonstrated through this period was very strong and very effective. And, physicians planned carefully. They managed to come up with mitigations, some of which we could assist with, changing the site of infusions, wider deployment of home care, and ensuring an intact supply chain. And all of that has proven very effective in Europe, thankfully, so far. And things look like they've been stabilized to a level where they're somewhat manageable. There are still challenges for new patients accessing diagnostic services and outpatient clinics and so forth. That's on its way back. But, the continuation of adherence to treatment and so forth has been very, very good. The continuity on clinical trials has been impressive. So overall, it has presented a number of challenges, but most of those challenges have been met quite effectively in the disease area that we work in.
And looking at your gene silencing or RNAi technology, do you think there's scope for that to be used to target this particular coronavirus?
Well, yeah, early on we recognized that this is an RNA virus. And that begs the question, can RNA silencing have an impact here? And back in the early days of Alnylam, when we started exploring a wide range of therapeutic strategies, we had programs in respiratory diseases that we learned a lot about delivery to the lung in those early days. Now, they are not programs that we've been actively pursuing in the last few years, but there is also one program that we've partnered with another company called Vir in infectious disease, which was around hepatitis B. So we also learned a lot about applying this technology to control the reproduction of viruses. So with that platform, right back in January, we put a team together to investigate the possibility of using RNA interference to control this virus. And indeed, that program has proven very promising. We identified sequences of DNA that were highly conserved through the evolution of coronaviruses, and that predicts that they're essential to the life of the virus. And we screened over 300 such targets and reduced it down to a small number of potential development candidates that were further screened in a model that our partners at Vir have to measure their effect on the virus. And in fact, it has been extraordinarily promising so far to see that this approach is hugely potent at repressing the growth of the environment of the virus, and at picomole concentrations can kill 99.9% of the virus that it encounters. So directly killing the virus with RNA interference is one strategy. The other strategy we're looking at is potentially, you may have heard lots spoken about these ACE receptors that humans have in their respiratory tract that give the virus something to latch onto when it's inhaled. And there is also the potential to repress the expression of those ACE2 receptors and reduces a person's propensity for the infection to take hold. So there's a number of strategies that we're pursuing, and with the first development candidate that we've identified, it will be a product delivered by nebulizer to the lung and targeted at controlling the reproduction of the virus and killing it, essentially. So we hope to be in the clinic before the end of 2020, meaning testing this in humans. So it will take a little bit of time, but it is running at a pace that we certainly haven't achieved before. And I think many companies in the biotech industry would report that the focus and the collaboration and the spirit that is behind this effort has moved things along much faster than we were able to manage even 10 years ago.
Well, that's certainly very encouraging to hear, and I'm sure the progress will be keenly watched. So clearly COVID-19 and the current pandemic is going to very much define certainly 2020, if not the longer term in the years to come. But looking, if we can turn to look at what it means to be a biotech in today's environment, what would you say have been some of the sector's current maybe challenges and highlights?
Well, first of all, if I look back over my lifetime, particularly from the time I went to university, there's never been a more exciting time than today in biotech. It's really an industry that whose promises has started to come to fruition. We're back in the 80s, we were looking at recombinant methods for manufacturing proteins. We were looking at the emergence of monoclonal antibodies and a growing understanding of the human genome. And over the last 30 years, that has evolved into developing a number of really exciting, highly targeted therapeutic strategies in gene editing, gene silencing, gene therapies, as well as the progress in using immune therapies, controlling cancer, and so forth. So it's a hugely exciting time. Of course, that brings its own challenges. Each of these technological platforms that have come along, such as recombinant proteins or monoclonal antibodies, once their potential has been realized, many companies crowd into the space, and the landscape changes very quickly, and the technology grows exponentially. And I think approaches to gene silencing and control of gene expression are just at that early phase now, where people are starting to join in. Which is great, because the whole idea behind this is to develop more treatments for more patients. The challenges that bring, I suppose, with our heritage in doing this for the last 18 years, we have established ourselves as leaders in RNAi, and we want to stay leaders. We want to stay relevant. We want to build a global biotech company based on this platform. And of course, that brings its own challenges in terms of the allocation of capital. The focus that was laser-like on just research and development a few years ago, it now has to be shared with questions of how we manufacture sufficient oligonucleotides and how we build distribution networks and sales and marketing infrastructure around the world in order to achieve that. More generally, though, the sort of challenges we face, regulators have to keep pace with all of this new technology that's coming out and constantly revise and reevaluate our regulatory systems to make sure they're fit for purpose. And similarly, health technology assessors and payers in countries need to have ways of fully assessing the value of these technologies. And sometimes that can introduce delays and rate limiting steps for access to patients for these drugs. And that can be frustrating. The development timeline is measured in years to decades. And if you add more years onto that by spent evaluating the value of the product before you can get paid for it, and patients are forced to wait for that, that can be frustrating, because it seems like we're creating unnecessary barriers to treating patients. So I think the importance of dialogue and a level of trust between the industry and those responsible for purchasing and paying drugs and those responsible for evaluating is necessary. And that dialogue is time consuming It's intensive, it's highly technical, but it is very necessary. And it's also necessary that it continues to evolve alongside the technology as it evolves.
So we've been running on an article series on our pharmaphorum.com website where we've been interviewing UK pharma and biotech general managers. I'd like to finish up this episode of the podcast by asking you about your own approach to leadership and, well, I guess, what it means to lead a biotech in 2020.
I guess I have a huge belief that if people have a clear view of the mission and what we're trying to achieve, and you facilitate people to bring their creativity and genius to that people will be motivated and find ways to pursue that goal, and it will foster innovation and creativity, and you make some real progress. So I think it was Steve Jobs that said we don't hire smart people to tell them what to do. We bring in smart people to come and tell us what to do. And I think there's a lot of merit in that philosophy. And it does help foster continuous creativity and innovation. Then beside that, you have to have financial discipline. I spoke earlier about the allocation of capital and what a challenging that question is. When the available capital has to be divided between research and development, selling expenses, distribution expenses, and manufacturing expenses. So bringing that discipline to managing your finances is also a very important element of building a successful biotech. So having a kind of a matrix organization where you bring balance to those different imperatives is vital. And I think the key to managing in a matrix is to really understand and question the biases that people bring to the decision making and try and conduct the orchestra so that it can work harmoniously, rather than one element of the matrix pulling harder than others and leading to distorted decisions. So it's all about bringing balance to those preferences and understanding the biases, I think. But what we do when you listen to a patient explaining the impact our drugs have on them and their families, what we do in this industry is just so relatable for any individual that I don't think you have to dig too hard to find the motivation to pursue that goal. And if you keep that central focus on a mission around patients and keep the various biases in the matrix in balance, I think you have a recipe for success.
Good stuff. Well, Brendan, thank you very much for joining me on the pharmaphorum podcast.
Thank you, Dominic. It's a pleasure.
That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast and my chat with Brendan Martin at Alnylam. You can find more details of this episode, including a download link for the podcast and information about other instalments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast and Stitcher, where you can find and subscribe to it by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website to sign up for daily or weekly email pharmaceutical news and analysis bulletins, and follow us on Twitter, where we are at pharmaphorum.